The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
Mr. President, your brother Ted recently on television said that after seeing the cares of office on you that he wasn't sure he'd ever be interested in being the president. I wonder if you could tell us whether, if you had it to do over again, you would work for the presidency and whether you can recommend the job to others.
Well, the answer is, the first is yes, and the second is no. I don't recommend it to others, at least for a while.
President Kennedy was the first president to take live televised questions from the press on a regular basis, and he would provide the model for what would become the modern television presidency. In this episode, we'll take a look at how JFK interacted with the media and how his press conferences gave some underrepresented voices a chance to be heard on a national stage. We'll have a conversation with reporters from today's White House press corps about JFK's influence and how different presidents have approached the relationships with the press once in office. All that and more next on this episode of JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to this episode of JFK 35. Today, presidents are expected to speak to the media live on television at regular intervals during their presidency. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy was the pioneer of the live televised press conference. He was the first president to hold these types of televised events live on television with no delay or editing. In his short 3-year administration, he held 64 of these open forum-style press conferences, or an average of one every 16 days. His first outing attracted more than 64 million viewers. On average, his live conversations with the country would attract 14 million viewers. In these news conferences, he would answer a variety of questions. Many of them would be responses to the opposing party, like this one from a reporter asking about the Republican calls to cut social and other federal programs to reduce the federal budget.
President, yes. Republicans in Congress are saying they can cut your budget all the way from $5 billion to $15 billion. Do you think there is any room for substantial cuts in the budget?
It's been suggested that we cut school lunches, that we cut aid to dependent children. I want to see these in more detail. I think we've been generalized enough. Are you going to cut these kind of programs, which are essential to a better life for our people? Are we going to make a determination that we're going to be permanently second best in space? Because if you cut the space program substantially, that's what you're writing into law. And I thought the United States had made a commitment that we were not going to be second permanently.
At times, the president would use the news conferences to show his anger to the nation by calling out the behavior of groups from outside or from within the country. In this April 1962 news conference, the president went on the attack against U.S. steel companies who he alleged artificially inflated their prices beyond their value at the cost of everyday Americans.
At a time when restraint and sacrifice are being asked of every citizen, the American people will find it hard, as I do, to accept a situation in which a tiny handful of steel executives whose pursuit of private power and profit exceeds their sense of public responsibility can show such utter contempt for the interests of 185 million Americans. A few gigantic corporations have decided to increase prices in ruthless disregard of their public responsibilities. Some time ago, I asked each American to consider what he would do for his country, and I asked the steel companies. In the last 24 hours, we had their answer.
The press conference participant numbers were much larger compared to today's average press conference size in the White House press room. JFK moved press conferences into the large State Department auditorium, which could fit more than 150 reporters in the room. The larger numbers allowed the president to take questions from a variety of reporters, including this question from Simeon Booker, a black news reporter covering the White House.
Mr. President, the White House News Photographers Association bars Negro members. Do you feel that a group attached to the White House should follow such a policy?
No, I don't.
I hope they'll let everyone in comes into the White House, and I would hope any associations that they make, so that I would hope that those who are involved with the organization, I'm sure that when the matter is brought to their attention, that they will permit everyone who is accredited and as a photographer to come to the White House. That's the way I'd certainly like to see it.
The press conferences would give JFK a chance to develop a back and forth with many of the reporters. One of those regulars was also one of the few women in the room, White House reporter May Craig. For the first time, the entire nation could watch those interactions live.
Yes, Miss Craig?
President, your speaking of historians induces me to ask you this. Most former presidents have put their official papers in libraries in their home states where they are not readily available to scholars and historians who come here to work with the Library of Congress and other agencies here. Have you decided where to put yours, and would you consider putting it in Washington?
Yes, I'm going to put it in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Mr. President, the practice of managed news is attributed to your administration. Mr. Salinger says he's never had it defined. Will you give us your definition and ask us why you find it necessary to practice it?
You are charging us with something, Miss Gray, and then you're asking me to define what it is you're charging me with. I think you might. Let me just say that we've had very limited success in managing the news, if that's what we've been trying to do. And perhaps you'd tell us what it is that you object to in our treatment of the news.
Are you asking me something?
Yes.
Well, I don't believe in managed news at all. I thought we ought to get everything we want.
Well, I think you should too, Miss Gray. I'm for that.
Not every reporter was thrilled with the idea of press conferences being televised. Charles Roberts, a print reporter at the time, said years later that most of the newspaper reporters, who made up the majority of press in the room, were opposed to the introduction of live television cameras and turning the conferences into a, quote, live TV spectacle, end quote. But today, TV cameras are as ubiquitous to press conferences as the reporters themselves. Joining me now to discuss how later presidents handled the addition of television cameras to the press corps are three White House reporters: NPR's White House correspondent and president of the White House Correspondents Association, Tamara Keith; New York Times White House photographer, Doug Mills; and Associated Press White House correspondent, Darlene Superville. Thank you all for joining me today.
Glad to be here with you.
Glad to be here. Delighted.
All right, so we're going to get right into this topic, which is the television presidency. And President Kennedy is sometimes often referred to as our first television president because it was in his administration where they started doing live televised press conferences that were not edited. He also participated in the first live televised debate with Richard Nixon. So just to start with President Kennedy, who this building is named after, what are your impressions of Kennedy on television compared to the presidents that you've had the opportunity to cover?
Well, mostly I'm just very jealous of the Kennedy press corps who got so many live primetime press conferences, because we spend a lot of time begging for press conferences, and he did them all the time. And just seeing, watching some old newsreel footage, seeing the size of the room where he did his press conferences and the size of the press corps, also the white maleness of the press corps, but just the size of the press corps. It's these are different times.
And do you guys have any opinions on the presidents you've covered versus watching Kennedy in those past historical clips?
I can jump in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when I think of Kennedy and seeing a lot of that footage, I think of Reagan too, because Reagan had the same sort of aura on stage. He had the charisma. He looked great on camera. And I always draw that correlation between those two whenever I think about Kennedy's video and then I see Reagan video. But I'm obviously jealous of the access that everybody had to Kennedy from the television side. And I see all the old reels and footage of him with the family or, sailboating and doing a lot of the activities that he did. And we're not seeing a lot of that right now.
I just think of how polished Kennedy was when he did the debate with Nixon and also some of the press conferences. Sharp suit, just really polished. And it's presidents now are a little polished, I should say. I don't want to say they're unpolished, but there was a difference between Kennedy and a lot of what we've seen, a lot of the presidents that we've covered.
Well, he was very image conscious. I would argue that, you know, a President Obama, although he wore his dad jeans occasionally, was, you know, he projected an image. And obviously President Trump, whether we agree with the choice of the length of his tie or his hair or whatever, like he is somebody who was acutely aware of how he looked. You know, I remember one of his top aides basically being the lighting director at the White House. Like, this is a top person who came into the White House, and yet he spent so much time working to make sure that President Trump had the right light at all times.
And camera angle.
And is there something about the advent of TV that did this? Like, you know, prior to President Kennedy, when presidents didn't have to worry about TV cameras being there, they sort of didn't have to think about how they presented themselves when talking to reporters, right? Are we seeing sort of like artificial representations of how presidents want to convey? Like, you know, they also want to convey a certain image. Like President Bush, the son, the younger, wanted to convey more of a relaxed image, whereas other presidents may have other opinions. What do you guys think about that?
I will say that I don't think LBJ was like super image conscious based on everything I know about him.
But as it evolved, right?
Right.
As it evolved, this became more of a thing to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at this point, it's not just TV. It's that they're out on social media. It's that, you know, they're on Instagram. They're everywhere. And the American people, if they want to, can see a lot of the President of the United States. And I think also our role as a press corps, you know, has evolved to this protective pool where we have 13 journalists who travel with the president wherever he goes. Now, we don't get to see every aspect of his life. We don't usually get to see him playing golf. That is different. Doug recently showed me a picture of President George H.W. Bush on the golf course talking about his game after it was over.
And I think also going back to Reagan and even Kennedy, there were only really three networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS. And so there wasn't the cable, you know, side of the video being shown 100 times a day on 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different networks now. And again, the social media, seeing video on there now, whether it's on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, or whatever, it's shown all day long. So I think that's something that it's filled now with every piece of video that we get with the president.
Also back then, with TV, that would have been the largest audience at that time they would have gotten for anything they did. Doug just mentioned the 3 networks. And so why give that up, right? Mm-hmm. Think of the State of the Union. It's still one of the largest television audiences a president gets one time a year.
But it is really diluted now.
It is diluted now, but when you think about back then and in the times of Kennedy, I think the natural draw to TV was the size of the audience, because more people could tune in than who could physically go to wherever the president was and giving a speech or making appearing at a rally or something like that.
It was the way to get the message out to the people.
It was the way to get the message out then.
Well, and let me just say though, and I think you guys will agree with me, as a radio person or as print and wire, there is still just an incredible draw of the bright lights. You know, administration officials will fall all over themselves to go talk to a very small audience of people watching on cable because of the bright lights and the draw of those bright lights of television in a way that they don't, you know, fall all over themselves to. Yeah,
you're almost being like, hey, over here, I know I don't have the lights, but I'm here.
I'm here. I have a microphone.
You know, again, you mentioned that, you know, there was sort of this appointment viewing for Kennedy. Like if he spoke, it would show up on the 6 o'clock news that evening. Now, that idea of appointment television is sort of blown out of the water, and people can go on social media, and we've seen presidents using social media. And for reporters trying to work and cover the president, what is it like when a president can use his own social media channels to get his message out? And do you feel that hurts or helps your job in trying to deliver, you know, the stories of the day when the president might, again, have other options?
Go ahead, Darlene, because I'll jump in.
Okay. We've all had to adapt to that, and I think the the use of social media by a president really came into being with President Donald Trump, who did a lot of stuff on Twitter, called people names, fired people, announced policy on Twitter.
Huge policy.
Huge policy.
Yeah, not a little thing, right?
Not little things, no. And so we all had to, I know I did, and my colleagues at the AP who cover the White House did, we had to reorient ourselves to making sure that his tweets would pop up on our phones and that we'd always have our phones with us so that you could see at any instant what he was doing, because that was where he lived. It's a little less now with the Biden White House, but there's still things that they also push out on Twitter or Facebook or whatever social media of choice they feel like using that particular day.
Doug, it sounded like you had something to say too.
Well, yeah, as a still photographer, and all of my colleagues would agree, social media has really offended a lot of us for a lot of reasons. We clearly don't like it because we feel like it is used as almost like propaganda because it's unfiltered. And for us, it really started during the Obama administration with Instagram, and then a little bit of Twitter, but also Facebook, and there were a couple other avenues, Flickr, that they could use to get out their pictures. And they were putting them out to the general audience, and people thought that they were shot by news photographers when they, in fact, were not. So that's really frustrating. It's still a frustrating time now when it happens at the White House. This White House does not do that as much. The Trump White House did not do it much either. But it's something that it started out very hot with the Obama administration, and then finally we pushed back a lot, and it slowed down. But yes, it's very frustrating.
Are there concerns, with the, every president now has their own staff photographers. Even John F. Kennedy had Robert Knudsen and others who were taking photos. But are you worried that with the advent of now they have the distribution channel, that they might be more convinced to say, well, maybe we don't need as many news photographers around me. I have, so-and-so here following me all around every day, and I have control over him.
That's
what he does, right?
Great point, Matt, because it is something that concerns all news photographers because, again, it's unfiltered, images, and those are moments that are chosen by the president's photographer or his editing staff, or during some administrations, the president of the United States agrees to photographs, or the first lady is involved. Well, we're going to put that out. We're going to put that out. We're going to put, and that's how it gets out versus a real live news picture that may not be doctored or filtered. Yeah, it's a big concern for us and frustrating and also.
And I think that the point that I would make about all of this is, yes, they can go around the filter, but there is a value in the filter. And a couple of things. I mean, first, we don't see ourselves as the filter, but we reach a broad cross-section of America. If they are just going to their Twitter followers, even if they have a huge Twitter following, they're going to people who have actively chosen to follow them. They're going to people who generally like them. And if they're actually trying to persuade America, they need us. They need the broader audience of Americans that we reach. I mean, Darlene's organization is, her stories run in every little tiny newspaper in America. And my stories run on, member stations in areas of the country where literally there is no other radio available except for the local public radio station. So there's an incredible reach that way. But also, if the White House is focused on, well, we can do an interview with, Cal Penn, who used to work in the Obama administration, and now he's guest hosting at The Daily Show. And, we'll put the president in an interview with a guy who's basically just going to kiss his butt and ask him questions he wants to be asked because he supports him. There actually is a governance and policy purpose in having to be able to answer tough questions. Because if you are pressed, if the press secretary is in a policy meeting and says, how am I going to explain this in the briefing room? Then that forces them to make sure that their policy is stronger, that their policy is defensible. And if they find ways to avoid that, like in the Trump administration, they didn't have a briefing for almost a year.
They had those helicopter conferences.
Well, yes, but that's different because in Chopper Talk, we're all shouting questions. We all look like terrible banshees. We're shouting questions. We look bad. And then the president picks what he wants to answer. He's picking the questions. Whereas in a formal press conference, the president picks the questioner, and like maybe they can try to game out what somebody might ask, but not really. They don't get to pick their question that way. And there's a reason why they like chopper talk and why they like interviews with favorable people who may not even really be journalists instead of, tougher interviews and press conferences.
At the start of this interview, we talked about how JFK, on average, gave so many press conferences. I think it was an average of 13 a day or something like that when you do the math. That doesn't happen today. Do you think that's because, as of what you've been saying, and what do you is there any hope that you can get back that type of sort of free exchange, or is that long gone and not coming back?
Well, to be optimistic, I would say every president is different. Every White House has different things that they favor. So President Obama, for instance, really liked sort of the long, thoughtful interview, the deep, lengthy interview. President Biden doesn't really like that as much. Both Bush presidents seem to love press conferences. Obviously, Reagan started out doing more, and then it sort of waned.
Yep.
So there's always the chance that we could get a president who actually enjoys press conferences again, or sees the value in press conferences again.
For you guys, for Darlene or Doug, what's the value of having more press conferences from your opinion?
I think one of the things that we get out of a press conference with the president, and also the public can get out of it, is that you can see the president in real time answer a question. You can watch him think through how to respond. Often it's a much longer answer than what we would get in chopper talk. And all those things benefit the public, our understanding of a particular policy he may be talking about, and the public's understanding of said policy as well. Just to see how a president thinks on his feet, thinks quickly, thinks through tough questions. All those things, I think, are a plus.
Well, and, I'll say, I'm still quoting things that President Biden said in his post-midterms press conference, because there were some things that he said that gave some real insight into his thinking. And I'm still leaning back on that, in part because we haven't really heard from him again in that sort of lengthy formal
at any
process.
length, right. Mm-hmm. He tends to give a lot of clipped answers, very short answers, not very long, kind of windy, thoughtful answers.
I think as far as press conferences for photographers, I just think that it's about access. The more access to the president that photographers have, the better for us. And you can, at any given press conference at the White House, there can be 20, 30, 40 still photographers there. All are going to have different angles. All are going to have different images. We're all competing against each other to get the best picture from that press conference. And like Darlene said, we get to see how their feelings are. Some of them wear them right on their sleeve. You can tell right away when somebody's upset or doesn't like a question, or, okay, that question's in their wheelhouse. They look really comfortable with that. And there's always emotion when it comes, whether there's trying times in the country, whether there's a war going on or shootings or death, anything that's going on, you can see it on the president's face. I mean, we had Obama crying one time during a press conference, and we've had Trump, shouting at reporters. Bush cried at a press conference in the Oval Office one time after 9/11. So yes, it's something that when I think of press conference, I think of access.
This is such a good conversation that I don't want to end, but I have a couple more questions before we finish. The next thing I want us to think about is, when President Kennedy was coming in, he was inspiring, right, a new generation, the generation that we would now call the boomer generation. They grew up on TV. TV was their medium. What do we think about millennials and Gen Z, people who are growing up with the next medium, whether it be social media, whether it be more commentary that they find, or satire news like The Daily Show, TikTok now? As reporters, how do you evolve your coverage to deal with an audience that's consuming news in a very different way than maybe was consumed 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
First, I would say millennials are old now.
No. Don't remind me.
But, for as much as I think that some of this is, there was so much angst about the MTV generation and those kids who grew up on music videos and had such short attention spans.
Sounds familiar. That sounds so familiar.
Yeah, and those people have turned into adults who consume long reads and are functional, I think. And this new generation obviously is getting information in different ways, in some cases in ways I don't understand. Like, I don't get TikTok. Yeah, I don't get it. But those same people are also listening to podcasts, right? Like, they'll listen to a podcast for like 2 hours. Yes, we as journalists we're not always on the leading edge, but we're always adapting. We're doing 3 different versions of our, like I do a story for the radio, I do a story for our podcast, which is put out in a completely different format, doing it for the web, and then we're tweeting or we're putting things out on Facebook or Instagram. Like, obviously Doug and the photographers have readily adapted to Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be for years. I mean, I've been in this 35, 40 years now, and it was always about the front page picture. And people would remember that. Oh, Mills, that was a really great front picture. Or it was on the sports section or whatever. Now they see it and there was a time, and still online, they'd see it online. But so many people now will come up to me and say, oh my God, I saw your picture on Instagram. It was beautiful. I saw that series of them. Or you tweeted out that picture. And so because, as Tam was saying, we put so much out now. I mean, I am feeding the New York Times news service, and then also I'm putting out pictures on Twitter and Instagram. So our platforms have broadened so much and you talk about different generations. And there are friends of mine who still pick up the New York Times newspaper who will tell me they've looked at a picture in the New York Times. And then I have my children's age. I have 2 daughters in their 20s. And so they talk about Instagram and Twitter and not as much TikTok, but yes, that's where they're seeing my images now and other photographers who are working at the White House.
This White House has a phrase that they like to say, that they are always trying to meet the people where they are. And with social media, news organizations also have to meet the people where they are. And so, for example, at AP, and Doug has talked about being on Instagram and multiple stories, versions of the same story for all your different formats. It's the same thing at AP too. We are heavily into tweeting. When I do stories, we have to include a couple of tweets that our social media team can tweet out. We all now have social media teams. AP's on Facebook. We just got on TikTok. So we have to adapt, as we've all been talking about, to reach the people where they are now on social media. A lot of times will take the public transportation, the bus or the subway to work, and I'm often one of the few people still reading a traditional newspaper, which is sad for me.
Though? But if they're on their devices, they just might be reading it on their phones, right?
Maybe, but...
Yeah, we went from looking at a newspaper, then to a laptop, and now it's on a phone.
On a phone.
Okay, my one last question, and it's hard to word this question because, the way the White House is covered, and when I say that, not really from folks like you, but, because, as we've talked about, media has grown, right? It's not just the main networks and the main bureaus and et cetera. Now you've got, primetime, 24/7 cable channels, and even just web content and podcasts, and there's
bloggers.
sort of a lot, and it's sort of a lot of right. It's
Substack.
It's kind of salacious out there. It's it can be very negative in a lot of ways what's out there. And the question is, do you think, with the way sort of politics is covered and the White House is covered, in the 60s, people looked at Kennedy and kind of said, I want to strive for public service and to be a public servant. And I guess the question is, how do you feel people, when they look at how public servants are covered today, do you think people go, boy, do I really want that job? Do I really want to get myself into public service? Do I want to be a I guess the question is, do you think that the way the White House and politics have been covered has maybe steered people away from good people from getting involved in public service?
I would say probably not necessarily. I think if there are students going to college or people who are interested in policy, right, regardless of how the White House is covered, they're not necessarily thinking about that. They're thinking about the policy they want to come in, they want to work on, they want to improve, change, whatever. So if they're policy-oriented and focused, I think they would still want to go work at the White House or in the government somewhere.
Tamara, Doug, do you agree, or do you think there's some parts of the way the media is that might scare some good people off?
Well, I mean, it could definitely scare some people off of journalism. But I actually think that I think that there's both sort of a blessing and a curse in the fact that politics have taken over as like an American hobby, and consuming political journalism has taken up a lot of space in a lot of people's brains. And in some ways that's great, but in other ways I think that it's not great, because things are so hyper polarized, because people can feel overwhelmed and frustrated seeing that polarization or feeling that polarization in their own families, for instance. But on the hopeful side, I think that there are people who are searching for a way to make a difference, and people who are searching for a way to sort of break through the noise. And I think that there are, I get on a soapbox about this, but yes, national politics is super important and interesting, but people can really make a difference in their neighborhoods, or they can make a tangible difference at a local or a smaller level by engaging in their communities. And I think that that's really important to do, and just sort of, consume the national politics from time to time.
And I would just throw out that, yes, I think politics has gotten dirtier, it's gotten angrier, but I also look on the other side of it, each administration that comes into the White House, they're so young, and they're eager to learn, and they want to do the best thing they can for not only the president, but for their party. And they work for peanuts. Literally, the people that we work with in the lower press office and some in the upper press office make $37,000 a year and are working 70 hours a week at a minimum. So, but those people love it so much and want to do good that they end up either leaving the White House after 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever, depending on what administration, and they go to different branches of government. And that's what I enjoy seeing that, because then I see them 10 years later, 20 years later, and they're still in government, and they're still doing great things, whether it's at the State Department or on Capitol Hill, working for a different senator. It's just, I enjoy seeing that, and I think it means a lot to the people who come in there and who really want to fix things.
Can I make one other point about social media?
Yes.
So there was a time at the White House when someone from the press office literally would come out with news releases, announcements, whatever, on paper. And there were slots for all the different news organizations, and they would drop the releases in the slots. And we'd go out and, that's how we got stuff from the White House. And then it migrated to email, and now we're on social media. And when I talked earlier about having to adapt to Twitter, I was just always used to looking at the inbox, right? Mm-hmm. Then you had to switch to Twitter. And so sometimes I wonder what is coming next, right? And what's the next way, the next social media thing, or the successor to social media that we're all going to have to adapt to if we're still covering the White House.
Or maybe we could just start having conversations again.
Well, there's that.
Well, thank you, the three of you, for joining me today. Appreciate it. And there is a forum at the JFK Library, which will be linked to this episode. And so thank you for participating in that as well. Thank you.
Absolutely.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Thrilled to be here.
My
Thank
pleasure.
You.
If you are interested in learning more about President Kennedy and his press conferences, we have links to transcripts of all 64 of his press conferences on our podcast page at jfklibrary.org/JFK35. You can also find audio, video, and photos from the president's meetings with the media on our page. If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at JFKLibrary using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.